the forgotten basement. I never imagined that my life would take such a turn. As I sit here, penning down the events that transpired, I can't help but feel a deep chill running down my spine. This is not just a story, but a recount of something that happened, something that still haunts me every night. If you are reading this, consider it a warning. A glimpse into the horrors that lie buried in the past, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It all began when I inherited my grandfather's old estate. The house had been in the family for generations, passed down from one member to another, each adding their own touch to its already ancient structure. When I was a child, I used to visit the place during summer vacations, running through its vast, dusty corridors, unaware of the secrets it held. But as I grew older, life took over, and the house became a distant memory, something I would reminisce about but never think of returning to. It changed when the will was read out to me, following my father's unexpected passing. I was surprised to learn that the house, along with its surrounding lands, had been left to me. My father, a stern and somewhat distant man, had never mentioned the estate in his later years, and I hadn't asked. It had slipped into the back of my mind, overshadowed by the hustle of city life. But now, it was mine. It took me a few weeks to finally visit the place. Life, as usual, kept me busy, but there was a gnawing curiosity inside me that wouldn't let go. When I finally made the drive to the countryside, I was struck by how little the house had changed. It stood tall and imposing, surrounded by ancient oaks, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The stone walls were weathered but strong, covered in a thick layer of ivy that seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. The interior was just as I remembered, dark, musty, and filled with the scent of aged wood and old books. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, and the air was thick with memories. I spent the first few days simply exploring, reacquainting myself with the place. Each room brought back a flood of memories, some pleasant, others tinged with a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until I decided to clean out the basement that things began to unravel. The basement was a place I had never ventured into as a child. My grandfather had always forbidden it, and even my father, a man of few superstitions, had told me to stay away from it. I never questioned why. It was simply one of those family rules that you accepted without asking. But now, as the sole owner of the house, I felt a strange compulsion to explore every nook and cranny, to uncover whatever secrets it held. The door to the basement was tucked away in a corner of the house, behind a set of creaky stairs that led down to the ground floor. It was an old wooden door, the kind that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The key, an old iron thing that I found in my grandfather's study, fit perfectly into the rusted lock. With a deep breath, I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, filled with the smell of earth and mold. I hesitated for a moment, a sense of foreboding washing over me, but I pushed it aside. This was my house now, and I had every right to explore it. The first thing that struck me as I descended the stairs was how cold it was. The deeper I went, the more the temperature dropped, until it felt like I had stepped into a refrigerator. The light from the bulb above barely penetrated the darkness, and I was forced to pull out my flashlight to see where I was going. The basement was larger than I had expected. It stretched out into the darkness, its walls lined with shelves that were filled with old boxes, tools, and what appeared to be jars of preserved goods. But it wasn't the size of the place that unnerved me. It was the atmosphere. There was something about the air down there, something oppressive, like the weight of 1,000 years pressing down on me.
I began to explore, moving from shelf to shelf, examining the contents. Most of it was mundane old tools, gardening equipment, a few rusted tins of paint. But then I found something that made my heart skip a beat.
Tucked away in a corner behind a stack of boxes was an old chest. It was made of dark wood, bound with iron bands that had long since rusted. The lock was broken and the lid was slightly ajar, as if someone had opened it in a hurry and forgotten to close it properly. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and dread as I approached it. The chest was filled with a variety of objects, each more unsettling than the last. There were old books, their pages yellowed with age, filled with strange symbols and writings that I couldn't understand. There were candles, their wax blackened, and a set of robes that looked like they belonged to some kind of ancient ritual. But what caught my eye the most was a small, ornate box, made of silver and engraved with intricate patterns. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hands. It was cold to the touch, and as I examined it, I noticed that there were symbols etched into the silver, symbols that matched those in the old books. With a trembling hand, I opened the box. Inside was a small black stone, smooth and polished, about the size of a marble. It seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, casting a shadow that was darker than the surrounding darkness. I felt a sudden rush of fear, a primal instinct telling me to put the stone back and leave the basement immediately. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the stone, by the weight. It seemed to pulse in my hand, as if it were alive. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the stone. It could have been minutes or hours. I had lost all sense of time. But eventually, I forced myself to put it back in the box and close the lid. The moment I did, I felt a sense of relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But that relief was short-lived. As I turned to leave, I heard something, a whisper barely audible coming from the darkness behind me. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the eerie atmosphere. But deep down, I knew it was something more. I quickly made my way back up the stairs, locking the door behind me. I tried to put the events of the basement out of my mind, but they lingered like a shadow that refused to be banished. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the black stone, felt its coldness in my hand, and heard that whisper in the darkness. The next few days passed in a blur. I busied myself with work, trying to distract myself from the growing unease that gnawed at my mind. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had been awakened in that basement, something that was now watching me. It wasn't long before strange things began to happen. At first, they were small. A flickering light, a door that would creak open on its own. But then they became more pronounced. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find the temperature in the house had dropped to near freezing, despite the heater being on. Objects would move on their own. Books falling off shelves, chairs sliding across the floor, and always there was that whisper, just at the edge of hearing, growing louder with each passing night. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I was just stressed from inheriting the house and dealing with all the responsibilities that came with it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew that something from that basement had followed me, and it was getting stronger. The final straw came one night when I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. I had just begun to drift off when I felt something cold touch my arm. I jerked awake, looking around the room, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness, thick and oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I told myself it was just the blanket, that I had imagined the touch. But then it happened again, this time on my leg. I threw off the covers and jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the air. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the room, but there was nothing. Just the familiar furniture, the same old walls. But then I heard it. That whisper, clearer than ever before, coming from the direction of the basement. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go back down there to confront whatever it was that I had awakened. I grabbed a jacket, the old iron key, and my flashlight, and made my way to the basement door. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floors as I made my way to the basement. The door loomed before me, its dark wood seeming to absorb the light from my flashlight. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the key before steeling myself and unlocking the door. Stairs creaked as I descended into the darkness. The air was even colder than before, and the smell of earth and mold was overpowering. My flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard the whisper again, louder this time, coming from the corner where I had found the chest. I forced myself to move forward, my heart pounding in my ears. The chest was still there, its lid slightly ajar, just as I had left it. But something was different. The atmosphere in the basement had changed, become heavier, more oppressive. It was as if the very air was charged with a malevolent energy. I approached the chest, my hands trembling as I reached for the lid. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what was inside, but I had no choice. I had to know. The lid creaked open, and there it was. The small silver box, exactly where I'd left it. But the black stone was gone. A wave of fear washed over me, so intense that it nearly knocked me off my feet. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The basement was plunged into darkness, and I was left standing there, alone in the cold, with the knowledge that something was in there with me. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold onto it. When I finally managed to turn it on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the basement, where there had been nothing before, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its body wrapped in what looked like tattered robes. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, feel the weight of it. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could sense its malevolence, its hunger. The whispering started again, louder now, filling the basement with its insidious presence. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew they were meant for me, knew they were calling me. My legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the spot by a fear so deep it consumed me. The figure took a step forward, and that broke the spell. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just knowing that I had to get away. I stumbled up the stairs, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The door was in sight, just a few more steps, but it felt like I was moving in slow motion, like something was pulling me back. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. The house was silent, but I could still hear the whispers in my head, could still feel the presence in the basement, waiting, watching. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, clutching the iron key, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't stay in the house, couldn't live with whatever was in the basement, but I also knew that leaving wouldn't solve anything. That presence, whatever it was, would follow me, would never let me go. In the end, I made a decision. I would leave, but not without taking one last look at the basement, one last attempt to understand what I had uncovered. I waited until morning, when the light of day seemed to drive away some of the fear, and made my way back to the basement. The door was still locked, but I could feel the presence behind it, waiting. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and descended the stairs once more. The basement was the same as I had left it, cold, dark, and filled with that oppressive atmosphere, but the figure was gone. The chest was still there, the silver box still inside, but the black stone was nowhere to be found. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all, trying to piece together the events that had led me to this moment. But in the end, I realized that some things are beyond understanding, beyond reason. I had uncovered something in that basement, something ancient and malevolent, and it would never leave me. I left the house that day, locking the door behind me. I didn't sell it, didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I simply walked away, leaving it to its secrets, knowing that they would stay buried as long as I stayed away. But even as I drove back to the city, the unease that had taken root in my chest refused to subside. The whispers were gone, but the memory of them lingered, like an echo that wouldn't fade. I tried to push it out of my mind, to focus on the road ahead, but every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see that figure standing in the middle of the road watching me as I left. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and anxious thoughts. I returned to work, tried to immerse myself in the familiar routine, but it was no use. The memories of the basement haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Every creak of the floorboards in my apartment, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, made my heart jump. It wasn't long before the nightmares started. In the dreams, I was always back in the basement. The cold, oppressive air pressed down on me as I stood in front of the chest, the silver box in my hands. But when I opened the box, the black stone wasn't inside. Instead, there was a void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to pull me in, consuming everything around it. The whispers were louder in the dreams, no longer a faint murmur, but a cacophony of voices, each one speaking in a language I couldn't understand but instinctively feared. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the sound of the whispers still ringing in my ears. But the most unsettling part was that, even in the waking world, I could feel the pull of the basement. It was as if something in that dark place was calling to me, beckoning me to return.
I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was all in my head. But the pull grew stronger with each passing day until it became almost unbearable. I found myself constantly thinking about the house, about the basement, about the things I had seen and the things I hadn't. It was as if the darkness had latched onto me, refusing to let go.
Then, one night, something happened that forced me to confront the reality of what I had awakened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window. I had just begun to drift off when I felt a sudden, intense coldness spread through the room. It was the same coldness I had felt in the basement, the same bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into my very soul. I sat up, my breath visible in the frigid air, and that's when I saw it, a shadow, darker than the night itself, standing at the foot of my bed. It was the figure from the basement, its hooded face turned toward me. The whispers began again, louder and more insistent, filling the room with their eerie chant. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't move either. It simply stood there, as if waiting for something. Then, slowly, it raised a hand, pointing toward the door. The meaning was clear. It wanted me to go back to the house, back to the basement. The thought filled me with dread, but I knew that if I didn't go, the figure wouldn't leave. It would haunt me forever, dragging me deeper into the darkness, until there was nothing left. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and called a taxi. I couldn't drive in my current state, not with my hands shaking so badly. The figure didn't move as I got out of bed and threw on some clothes. It simply watched me, its presence looming over me like a storm cloud. When the taxi arrived, I left my apartment without looking back. The figure followed me, its shadow stretching along the walls as I hurried down the stairs and out into the night. The coldness clung to me like a second skin, the whispers growing louder with each step I took. The drive to the house was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The taxi driver didn't say a word, didn't even glance in the rearview mirror. It was as if he couldn't see the figure sitting next to me, couldn't feel the oppressive cold that filled the car. I wondered if I was the only one who could see it, the only one cursed to bear witness to this nightmare. When we finally arrived at the house, I got out of the car without saying a word. The figure was already at the front door, waiting for me. The house loomed in the darkness, its windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. I felt a deep sense of dread as I approached the door, but I knew I had no choice. The door creaked open as I turned the key, and the coldness intensified as I stepped inside. The figure was already moving toward the basement door, its shadow flickering along the walls like black fire. The whispers had grown so loud now that they drowned out all other sound, filling my head with their insidious chant. I hesitated at the top of the basement stairs, the fear almost overwhelming, but the figure was behind me now, blocking my escape. I had to go down. I had to face whatever was waiting for me in the darkness below. Stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the cold, the flashlight in my hand barely cutting through the thick darkness. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of earth and decay. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw that the basement had changed. The shelves were still there, but they were empty now, the tools and jars gone. The chest was still in the corner, its lid closed, but there was something different about it. The darkness seemed to gather around it, swirling like a vortex, and the whispers were louder than ever, coming from within the chest itself. I knew what I had to do. I had to open the chest, to confront whatever was inside. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the lid, but I forced myself to open it. The silver box was still inside, its surface gleaming in the dim light, but the black stone was gone. In its place was something else. A small, withered hand, its fingers curled into a fist. It looked like it had been severed from a child, the flesh dark and desiccated, the bones visible through the thin skin. The sight of it filled me with a deep, primal terror, and I recoiled, almost dropping the flashlight. But then something happened that made my blood run cold. The hand began to move. Slowly, its fingers unfurled, revealing something clutched in its palm. A small black stone, just like the one I had found before. The hand opened fully and the stone rolled out, landing on the bottom of the chest with a soft thud. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. The basement was still, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. I felt a faint glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe it was over, that maybe I had faced whatever it was and won. But that hope was shattered when the figure appeared in front of me, its hooded face inches from mine. I could see its eyes now glowing like embers in the darkness. It reached out, its hand closing around the stone, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me as the whispers returned, louder and more malevolent than ever. The figure stepped back, holding the stone in its hand, and I watched in horror as it began to change. The darkness swirled around it, growing thicker and more tangible, until it seemed to consume the figure entirely. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, filling the basement with their cacophony, and I felt something inside me break. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the flashlight flickering wildly as I stumbled up the stairs. The whispers followed me, echoing in my mind, pulling at me with invisible hands. I could feel the darkness at my back closing in. I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. The house was dark and silent, but I could still feel the presence of the figure, still hear the whispers, even through the thick wooden door. I knew then that there was no escaping it. Whatever I had awakened in that basement, it was bound to me now, tied to my very soul. The house was its prison, and I was its jailer, doomed to live with the knowledge that I had unleashed something terrible into the world. I left the house that night, but I couldn't leave the whispers behind. They followed me, haunting my every step, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. I tried to outrun them, moving from place to place, but it was no use. The darkness had claimed me, and there was no escape. I write this now as a warning to whoever finds it. The house is still out there, still waiting, and the darkness is still inside, waiting for the next unlucky soul to awaken it. If you ever find yourself near that place, turn away. Don't go inside. Don't open the basement door. Because once you do, there's no going back. There's only the darkness and the whispers and the knowledge that you have unleashed something that should have stayed buried. And that is a burden I wouldn't wish on anyone. The Midnight Caller. I was never one to believe in the supernatural, nor did I put much stock in ghost stories or urban legends. Life had taught me to rely on what I could see, touch, and measure, to place my faith in the tangible and the rational. But all of that changed one cold October night when I received the first phone call. It was 3:00, and my phone rang. The sound jolted me awake, my heart pounding in the sudden stillness of the night. I blinked in the darkness, disoriented, mind struggling to catch up with the abrupt interruption of my sleep. Who would be calling at this hour? My mind raced through the possibilities. An emergency, perhaps. But as I reached for the phone, a sense of unease settled over me. Something about this felt wrong. Unknown number. The unease deepened, but I answered anyway, curiosity getting the better of me. Hello. My voice was thick with sleep, and I cleared my throat, waiting for a response. For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. I was about to hang up when I heard it. A faint, raspy voice, barely more than a whisper. Do you remember me? The question hung in the air, the voice eerily familiar yet completely foreign. I felt a chill run down my spine, my grip tightening on the phone. Who is this? I demanded, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Think back. The voice continued, ignoring my question. Think back to when it all began. There was something in the way they spoke. something that sent a surge of fear through me. I tried to place the voice to figure out why it sounded so familiar, but my mind drew a blank. "I don't know who you are, but this isn't funny," I said, a note of anger creeping into my tone. "Don't call here again." The line went dead, leaving me in the oppressive silence of my bedroom. My hand was trembling as I set the phone down, my heart still pounding in my chest. I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin, but sleep didn't come easily. The voice echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edges of the darkness. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had been a prank, a random act of someone with too much time on their hands, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. As the day wore on, I found myself glancing at the clock more often than usual, dreading the approach of night. And when the clock struck 3:00 a.m., the phone rang again. I sat bolt upright in bed, the sound piercing the stillness of the night. My heart raced as I reached for the phone, the screen once again displaying unknown number. I hesitated, a part of me not wanting to answer, but I couldn't ignore it. "Hello?" My voice was steadier this time, though I couldn't hide the underlying tension. "Do you remember me now?" The same voice, the same airy familiarity, as if they were speaking directly into my soul. "I don't know who you are," I replied, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. "What do you want from me?" "You will remember," the voice said, an edge of something sinister creeping into their tone. The line went dead again, leaving me in the silence. This time, I didn't even try to go back to sleep. I sat in bed, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was this person? How did they know me? And why did they sound so familiar? The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. The calls continued, each one exactly at 3:00, and each time the voice seemed to know more about me. Details about my life, my past, things that no stranger could possibly. It was as if they were peeling back the layers of my memories, one by one, revealing secrets I had looked. "Do you remember the house on Willow Lane?" the voice asked one night, their tone almost taunting. I froze. The house on Willow Lane. A place I hadn't thought about in years. A place that held memories I had tried to forget. How could they know about that? "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. "Why are you doing this?" But the only response was the faint sound of breathing, and then the line went dead. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The next day, I went to the phone company, demanding they trace the calls. But when the technician pulled up my records, he gave me a puzzled look. "There's nothing here," he said, frowning at the screen. "No calls at all, especially not at 3:00, and stared at him in disbelief. "That's impossible. I've been getting calls every night." He shook his head, tapping a few keys on the keyboard. "I'm sorry, but there's no record of any incoming calls. Maybe it's a glitch or something else." The words sent a shiver down my spine. What could be happening? Was I losing my mind? But the calls continued, relentless, each one driving me closer to the edge. The voice knew everything. My childhood, my fears, my regrets. And each call seemed to bring with it a new revelation, a new piece of the puzzle that I didn't want to solve. One night, after another sleepless evening filled with anxiety and dread, I made a decision. I was going to record the call. If no one believed me, I would have proof that I wasn't going insane. I set up my phone to record automatically at 3:00, and lay in bed waiting. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest, the anticipation almost unbearable, and then right on cue the phone rang. I answered it, my hands shaking. "Hello." The voice was different this time. Harsher, more urgent. "Do you remember the accident?" My blood ran cold. The accident. The one thing I had tried so hard to forget, the memory I had buried deep within myself. How could they know about that? "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Tell me what happened," the voice demanded. "Tell me the truth." I couldn't. The words were stuck in my throat, the memories too painful, too terrifying to confront. I hung up, my entire body shaking, and sat there in the darkness, the weight of the past crushing down on me. But when I played back the recording, there was nothing. Just static, a faint hum of white noise. The voice, the questions. That was when I realized that this was no ordinary prank. This was something far more sinister, something that defied logic and reason. The calls weren't just coming from an unknown number. They were coming from somewhere beyond, somewhere that I couldn't reach or understand. The next night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, my mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of my past that the voice had dredged up. The house on Willow Lane, the accident. The memories I had buried so deep that even I had forgotten them. And then the phone rang again. This time, I didn't answer. I couldn't. The fear was too great, the weight of the truth too heavy to bear. I watched as the screen lit up with the unknown number, the sound of the ringtone piercing the silence. But I didn't move, didn't even breathe. As the phone rang and then finally fell silent. But the relief was short-lived, because even though I hadn't answered, the voice came anyway, whispering in my ear, filling the room with its cold, eerie presence. "Tell me what happened," it said, the words sending a shiver down my spine. "Tell me the truth." I couldn't escape it. The voice was everywhere. On the phone, in my head, in my dreams. It followed me, haunted me, until I couldn't tell where reality ended and the nightmare began. And then, one night, I finally broke. I couldn't take it anymore, couldn't live with the fear, the guilt, the weight of the secrets I had buried. I picked up the phone at 3:00 a.m., my hand shaking, tears streaming down my face. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please stop. I can't take it anymore." But the voice was relentless. "Tell me what happened," it repeated, the words echoing in my mind. "Tell me the truth." And so I did. I told the voice everything. About the house on Willow Lane, about the accident, about the mistakes I had made, the lives I had destroyed. I confessed it all, every dark secret, every hidden truth, until there was nothing left to tell. The line went silent, the voice finally satisfied. But the silence was more terrifying than the whispers had ever been, because now there was nothing left. No more secrets, no more lies, only the cold, empty truth. And that was when I realized the terrible truth. The voice wasn't trying to punish me. It wasn't trying to torment me. It was me. I was the one who had called, the one who had haunted myself with the truth I couldn't face. The voice was my own, a manifestation of the guilt and fear that I had buried so deep within myself that it had taken on a life of its own. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless and disoriented. I had been tormenting myself, unable to escape the memories that haunted me, the truth that I had tried so hard to forget. But now that I had confessed, there was no turning back. The truth was out, and I had to face the consequences. For a few moments, I sat in stunned silence, the weight of what I had done settling over me like a heavy blanket. I had been living in denial, convincing myself that I could move on, that the past was behind me, but it wasn't. It had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface, and now that it had, there was no escaping it. I looked around the room, feeling the coldness of the night seep into my bones. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if the very air around me was closing in. I could feel the presence of the voice still lingering in the corners of the room, even though I knew it was just a part of me. I had opened a door that could never be closed again. But now that the truth was out, what was I supposed to do? How could I live with myself, knowing what I had done? The guilt was overwhelming, suffocating, and I knew that I couldn't continue like this. I had to find a way to make things right, to atone for my sins. But I didn't know where to start. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't live with the weight of my guilt anymore. I had to confront my past, face the consequences of my actions, and find a way to make amends. It was the only way to silence the voice, to find some semblance of peace. The first step was to return to the house on Willow Lane. I hadn't been there in years, not since the accident, but I knew that was where I had to start. It was where everything had gone wrong, where the dark spiral of guilt and fear had begun. If I could face the memories there, maybe I could find a way to move forward. The drive to Willow Lane was long and filled with trepidation. The closer I got, the heavier the weight in my chest became. The memories I had tried so hard to suppress came flooding back, each one more painful than the last. But I forced myself to keep going, knowing that I couldn't run from this anymore. When I finally arrived, the sight of the old house sent a shiver down my spine. It looked exactly as I remembered it, as if time had stood still. The windows were dark, the paint peeling, and the yard overgrown with weeds. But it wasn't the dilapidated state of the house that filled me with dread. It was the memories it held. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet, the only sound in the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else. Something darker that I couldn't quite place. I approached the front door with a sense of trepidation, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dark, musty interior of the house. The air was stale, filled with the smell of dust and neglect. I hesitated for a moment, the fear almost overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't turn back. I had to face whatever was waiting for me inside. As I stepped into the house, the memories hit me like a tidal wave. I could see the ghostly images of the past playing out in front of me, the scenes of my childhood that I had tried so hard to forget. I could hear the echoes of laughter, of voices long gone, and the shadow of the accident that had changed everything. I made my way through the darkened rooms, each one filled with the weight of the past. The memories were everywhere, suffocating, pulling me down into the darkness. But I kept going, determined to find the source of the voice, the source of my guilt. It wasn't until I reached the basement door that I realized where I had to go. The basement had always been a place of fear for me, a place where the darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. It was where the accident had happened, where the guilt had taken root and festered over the years. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, the memories almost too much to bear. But I knew that I couldn't run from this anymore. I had to face the darkness, confront the truth that I had buried for so long. I descended the stairs slowly, each step heavy with dread. The air grew colder as I went deeper, the darkness more complete. When I reached the bottom, I felt a chill run down my spine. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, dark, damp, and filled with the weight of the past. And there, in the corner of the room, was the source of my torment. It was an old rotary phone, the kind you don't see anymore, covered in dust and cobwebs. The sight of it sent a shiver through me, and I knew that this was where the voice had come from. This was where I had made the calls, where I had been calling myself. I approached the phone with a sense of trepidation, my heart pounding in my chest. The memories of the accident flooded back, clearer now than they had ever been. I could see it all, the fear, the guilt, the pain of that day. And I knew that I had been trying to calm myself, trying to force myself to face the truth that I had buried so deep. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the receiver. And for a moment, there was only silence, the oppressive darkness pressing in around me. But then I heard it. The voice, my voice, speaking to me from the other end of the... "It's time to face the truth," the voice said, its tone gentle yet insistent. "It's time to forgive yourself." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, the tears streaming down my face as I listened. The voice wasn't trying to torment me. It was trying to help me, trying to make me see that I couldn't keep running from the past. And so I stood there in the darkness, holding the phone to my ear as I finally confronted the truth. I had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I couldn't keep punishing myself for them. I had to find a way to forgive myself, to move on, and to live with the knowledge of what I had done. When I finally hung up the phone, I felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The darkness was still there, the memories still painful, but I knew that I could face them now. I could start to heal. I left the house on Willow Lane that day, knowing that I would never return. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. I could move forward, find a way to live with the truth, and make amends for the mistakes I had made. And as I drove away, the sun rising in the distance, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The voice was gone. The calls had stopped, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally start to live again. The midnight caller had forced me to confront the darkest parts of myself, to face the truth that I had buried for so long. But in doing so, it had also given me a second chance. A chance to make things right, to find peace, and to move on. And for that, I would always be grateful. When last letter, it had been 5 years since I buried her, yet the memories remained as vivid as the day she passed. Sarah was the love of my life, my anchor in a world that often felt chaotic and unyielding. Her sudden death left me adrift, and though I tried to find solace in work, in friends, in anything that could distract me from the yawning void she left behind, nothing could fill the emptiness. The house we shared had become a mausoleum of our love, each room a shrine to the life we had built together. I could not bring myself to change anything. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her favorite books still lined the shelves, and her scent lingered on the sheets we once shared. It was on a dreary autumn afternoon that the letter arrived, the day marked by the kind of gray skies that seemed to mirror my mood. I had just returned from the grocery store, the mundane chore offering a brief respite from the monotony of grief, when I noticed the envelope on the doormat. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in a hand I knew all too well. Sarah's handwriting. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the envelope, my heart pounding in my chest. It was impossible. She'd been dead for 5 years, yet here it was, as real as the ache in my chest. I picked up the letter with trembling hands, a cold sweat breaking out on my brow. The paper was old, yellowed with age, as if it had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I took a deep breath and carefully opened the envelope, pulling out the single sheet of paper inside. The familiar scent of her perfume, the subtle mix of lavender and jasmine, wafted up from the paper, bringing tears to my eyes. The letter was short, written in the flowing, elegant script that I had seen so many times before. My dearest Thomas, if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. But know that I've always loved you, and I continue to love you even now. There is something I must tell you, something I could never bring myself to say while I was alive. A great danger is coming, one that I have tried to protect you from for so long. But now I am no longer able to shield you from it. You must go to the place where we first met. There you will find the truth, and with it, the means to protect yourself. Trust no one, not even those closest to you. I wish I could tell you more, but time is short, and the danger is closing in. Please, Thomas, do not ignore this warning. Your life depends on it. With all my love, Sarah. I read the letter over and over, my mind struggling to comprehend the words. What danger could she have been referring to? And why had she kept this from me while she was alive? My thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a growing sense of dread. The place where we first met. My mind immediately went to that rainy afternoon at the old bookstore on the corner of Maple and 6th. It was a small, cozy place, the kind of store that smelled of old books and memories. We had both reached for the same book, our hands brushing, and that simple touch had sparked something that would grow into a love I thought would last forever. I had to go. There was no question. Whatever this danger was, it was real enough to drive Sarah to send this letter even from beyond the grave. I grabbed my coat and keys, my heart racing as I hurried out the door. The drive to the bookstore was a blur, the streets passing by in a haze of rain and autumn leaves. The old bookstore had seen better days. The windows were dusty, the paint peeling, but it still held the charm of a place where time seemed to stand still. I pushed open the door, the bell above tinkling softly as I stepped inside. The familiar scent of old paper and leather-bound books greeted me, a bittersweet reminder of the countless afternoons Sarah and I had spent here browsing the shelves, lost in our own little world. There was no one in the store, the aisles empty, the air thick with silence. I walked slowly down the aisles, my eyes scanning the shelves, searching for something, anything, that might hold the answers I needed. As I reached the back of the store, a familiar book caught my eye. It was the same one Sarah and I had both reached for that fateful day, a worn copy of Wuthering Heights. My hand trembled as I pulled the book from the shelf. As I opened it, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. I bent down to pick it up, my heart pounding in my chest. The paper was old, like the letter, and as I unfolded it, I saw that it was a map. The edges were frayed and the ink had faded in places, but I could still make out the details. It was a map of the town, with a red X marked at a location on the outskirts, a place I didn't recognize. Beneath the map, written in Sarah's handwriting, were the words, "Find the key and you will find the truth." My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. What key? What truth? I stared at the map, the location marked by the red X burned into my memory. I knew I had to go there to find out what Sarah had been trying to tell me. But a part of me hesitated. What if this was all a mistake? What if I was chasing shadows, led by the grief that had consumed me since her death? But the urgency in Sarah's letter, the fear in her words pushed me forward. I had to know. I had to understand what had driven her to send me this message even from beyond the grave. The drive to the outskirts of town was tense, the map clutched tightly in my hand as I navigated the winding roads. The rain had intensified, the sky darkening as the storm moved in, the weather mirroring the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. As I approached the location marked on the map, I saw that it led to an old, abandoned estate. The house was large, looming in the distance, like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The windows were boarded up, the paint chipped and faded, and the grounds were overgrown with weeds and brambles. The place had an air of decay, of something long dead and forgotten. I parked the car at the edge of the property, the engine ticking as it cooled. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the rain pattering against the roof of the car. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the house, before steeling myself and stepping out into the storm. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood as I made my way up the overgrown path to the front door. The house loomed above me, its dark windows like empty eyes staring down at me, judging me. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the metal cold and slick beneath my fingers. The door creaked open with a groan, the sound echoing through the empty halls as I stepped inside. The interior of the house was dark, the air heavy with the smell of dust and mildew. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I made my way through the foyer, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The furniture was covered in sheets, ghostly forms in the darkness, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the room like shrouds. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I moved deeper into the house, the sense of unease growing with each step. There was something about this place, something that felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets I couldn't hear. I followed the map, my steps leading me to a door at the end of a long hallway. The door was old, the wood warped and cracked, and as I reached for the handle, I noticed that it was locked. The words on the map echoed in my mind. Find the key, and you will find the truth. But where was the key? I glanced around the hallway, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of it. As I searched, a sudden thought struck me. The book. The map had been hidden in Wuthering Heights, the book that had brought Sarah and me together. Perhaps the key was hidden in a similar way, tucked away in one of the old books that lined the shelves of the estate's library. With renewed determination, I made my way to the library, the sense of urgency growing with each passing moment. The library was a large room, the walls lined with shelves filled with dusty old books. The air was thick with the smell of aged paper, and as I began to search through the volumes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My fingers traced the spines of the books, each one a potential hiding place for the key I sought. Minutes passed, then hours, as I combed through the shelves, my frustration mounting with each fruit. But then, as I pulled a particularly old and worn book from the shelf, something fell to the floor with a soft thud. I looked down and saw a small, ornate key lying at my feet, the metal tarnished with age. My heart raced as I picked it up, the weight of it heavy in my hand. This was it, the key to unlocking whatever secret Sarah had been trying to protect me from. I returned to the locked door at the end of the hallway, the key clutched tightly in my hand. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the house, and with a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, the walls lined with shelves filled with strange, unsettling objects. Jars filled with murky liquids and unidentifiable substances, old books bound in leather and marked with symbols I didn't recognize, and photographs. Dozens of photographs, pinned to the walls. As I stepped closer, my eyes widened in shock as I recognized the faces in the photographs. They were all of Sarah, taken at different times throughout her life. Some were of her as a child, others as a teenager, and many more as the woman I had loved and lost. But there was something wrong with the photos. In each one, a shadowy figure stood behind her, its face obscured, its presence unsettling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I studied the photos, a growing sense of dread gnawing at my insides. Who was this figure? And why had it been following Sarah all her life? My eyes were drawn to a journal lying open on a nearby table, the pages filled with Sarah's handwriting. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I began to read. The journal detailed a secret life, one that Sarah had never shared with me. She wrote of strange occurrences, of seeing the shadowy figure in her dreams, and then later in waking life, she wrote of how it had haunted her, following her wherever she went, watching, waiting. And she wrote of how she had discovered that the figure was not just a figment of her imagination, but something real. Something malevolent. The journal revealed that the figure was an ancient entity, one that had been bound to Sarah's family for generations, feeding off their fear and suffering. It had driven her ancestors to madness, to despair, and finally to death. And now it set its sights on me. Sarah's final entry was a desperate plea, a warning to me to leave, to run as far as I could to escape the fate that had befallen her and her family. But it was too late. Even as I read the words, I felt the air grow colder, the shadows in the room deepening, closing in around me, and then I saw it. The figure from the photograph standing in the corner of the room, its eyes, dark, hollow voids, locked onto mine. A wave of terror washed over me as it began to move slowly, deliberately, toward me. The last thing I remember before everything went black was Sarah's voice, echoing in my mind, telling me to run, to escape. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, the darkness closing in, suffocating me, and then there was nothing. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor of the library, the morning light streaming through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The house was silent, the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over it the night before now gone. I sat up, my head pounding, my body aching as if I had been in a fight. The key was still clutched in my hand, but the door it had unlocked was now gone, as if it had never existed. The shelves were empty, the strange objects and photographs vanished without a trace. Had it all been a dream? And the hallucination brought on by grief and stress, but the letter, the map, the journal, they had all been real. And the figure had been real too. I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting, watching. I knew then that the danger Sarah had warned me about was not just a physical threat, but something far more insidious. It was a darkness that had followed her all her life, and now it had latched onto me. I left the house that day, but I could not escape the feeling that I was no longer alone, that something was with me, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah had tried to protect me, but in the end she had only delayed the inevitable. The last letter from my wife had opened the door to a nightmare, one that I knew I would never wake from, and as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I began to see the figure again, just as Sarah had. It's in the corners of my vision, in the reflections of mirrors, in the darkest corners of my home. It was always there, watching, waiting. I knew then that I would never escape it. The darkness that had claimed Sarah had now claimed me, and there was no running from it. My only hope was that, when the end came, I would find peace in the knowledge that I had been loved, and that Sarah and I would be together again, even if it was in the darkness. But until then, I would live in fear, knowing that every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, could be the end. The last letter from my wife had sealed my fate, and now all I could do was wait for the darkness to take me to a stranger's reflection. It began with a simple unsettling observant. My reflection wasn't quite right. At first, it was a minor annoyance, a flicker of something amiss in the mirror that I could easily brush off. But as days turned into weeks, the unease grew. The reflection in my mirror started behaving independently, making me question my sanity. It seemed to possess a malevolent intent, its movements and expressions not matching my own. This is the story of how my own reflection began to unravel my life, pushing me into a nightmarish reality where nothing was as it seemed, and every glance at the mirror brought me closer to an incomprehensible terror. The day I first noticed something wrong with my reflection was an ordinary one. It was a Tuesday morning and the sky outside was overcast, the gray clouds hanging low as if burdened by the weight of the world. I had just woken up and was preparing for another day at the office. My routine was monotonous: shower, coffee, shave. Nothing ever changed. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, my razor gliding over my face, when I saw it. A brief, strange flicker in the glass. It was as though my reflection had moved independently for a fraction of a second, an imperceptible shift that didn't correspond with my own actions. I blinked, wondering if I was still half asleep, but the sensation lingered. Shaking my head, I dismissed it as a trick of the light or a remnant of a dream. I finished my routine and went about my day, but the unease clung to me like a persistent shadow. That night, as I sat in my living room reading a book, I kept glancing at the mirror across the room. The feeling that something was not quite right intensified, but I forced myself to focus on the pages of my book. The following days were marked by increasingly strange occurrences. Each time I looked at my reflection, it seemed to be slightly out of sync with my actions. Sometimes it would mimic my movements with a delay, and other times it would make gestures or expressions that I wasn't consciously aware of. It was as if my reflection had a mind of its own, one that was not entirely in harmony with mine. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I decided to pay closer attention to the mirror. I stood in front of it, staring intently, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine. My reflection began to smirk, a small, unsettling grin that was not my own. It was a subtle expression, but it was unmistakable. I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away as the reflection's grin grew wider. My own face remained expressionless, mirroring my confusion and growing anxiety. Over the next few days, the behavior of my reflection became more pronounced. It started to move on its own, acting out scenarios that I hadn't initiated. I would be sitting quietly and my reflection would suddenly start making frantic gestures or mouthing silent words. It became increasingly clear that whatever was happening was more than just a figment of my imagination. I began to question whether I was losing my grip on reality. Desperation led me to seek help, but who would believe such a bizarre story? My closest friends and family brushed it off as stress or a possible mental health issue. The isolation of my experience only deepened my fear. One night, the situation took a sinister turn. I was lying in bed, the lights out, trying to fall asleep. I could see the reflection of the moonlight streaming in through the window, casting faint shadows in the room. As I closed my eyes, I heard a soft, eerie whisper, almost like a hiss, coming from the direction of the mirror. I opened my eyes, and there it was. My reflection staring back at me with a look of malevolent satisfaction. The eyes in the mirror were not my own. They were dark, void of any warmth, and filled with a cold, unsettling malice. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or look away as the reflection seemed to grow more animated, its mouth moving in a silent, mocking taunt. Determined to confront this nightmare, I began documenting the occurrences. I set up a camera in front of the mirror, hoping to capture any unusual behavior. What I found was both horrifying and surreal. The footage showed my reflection moving independently, making grimaces and gestures that I had never intended. The reflection appeared to be engaged in a sinister form of communication with itself, as though it were plotting something I could not comprehend. As the days went by, the reflection's behavior escalated. It started to act out disturbing scenarios, as if reenacting some twisted performance. It would scream silently, its mouth contorting into grotesque shapes, while my own face remained blank and passive. A sense of malevolence emanating from the reflection was palpable, and I could no longer ignore the growing terror it inspired. One particularly dark night, I had a nightmare that seemed to blend seamlessly with reality. I dreamt that I was trapped inside the mirror, facing the reflection that had become a monstrous version of myself. It taunted me, its voice a chilling echo that reverberated through the dreamscape. When I woke up, drenched in sweat, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, my reflection glaring back at me with a look of triumph. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of the nightmare and its connection to my waking reality. The final straw came when I noticed that the reflection had started to act out violent scenarios. It would mimic actions that I hadn't performed, such as slamming objects or making threatening gestures. The reflection seemed to be feeding off my fear, growing stronger and more aggressive with each passing day. The line between reality and reflection blurred, and I began to feel as though I was losing control over my own life. Desperate for answers, I reached out to an old friend who was an expert in paranormal phenomena. I recounted everything that had happened, though I could tell from the look on his face that he was skeptical. He agreed to help, and together, we conducted a series of investigations into the mirror and its origins. What we uncovered was both shocking and terrifying. The mirror had once belonged to a notorious occultist who had practiced dark rituals in the early 1900s. It was said that the mirror was a conduit for malevolent spirits, a gateway between the physical world and a dark, unknown realm. The occultist had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the mirror had been passed down through various owners, each of whom had experienced strange and disturbing phenomena. As we delved deeper, we discovered that the mirror had been cursed, its dark energy entwining with the reflections it captured. The reflection I was experiencing was not merely a trick of light, but a manifestation of the malevolent force that had been trapped within the mirror. The entity seemed to feed on fear and distress, growing stronger as it manipulated my reflection to torment me. The reflection had become an obsession. Every time I approached the mirror, I was met with a mixture of dread and curiosity, a compulsion to confront whatever was lurking behind that glassy surface. Despite the terrifying experiences, I couldn't resist the urge to study the mirror and its sinister reflection more closely. I started spending hours each day examining it, documenting every anomaly and trying to make sense of what I saw. I began researching mirrors and their historical significance, hoping to find clues about their potential for malevolence. I pored over ancient texts and online forums, discovering that mirrors have long been associated with supernatural phenomena, from legends of mirrors as portals to other realms to stories of cursed reflections. I found numerous accounts of mirrors behaving in strange and disturbing ways, but none matched the severity of what I had encountered. One night, as I was browsing through a particularly obscure book on occult practices, I stumbled upon a reference to a ritual involving mirrors. It described a process of binding and cleansing mirrors that had been tainted by dark forces. The ritual required specific incantations and symbolic gestures, and it seemed to align with what I had learned about my own mirror. I decided to attempt the ritual myself, believing that it might offer a solution to the torment I was enduring. The ritual was complex and required precise execution. I gathered the necessary materials: candles, salt, a silver knife, and a series of intricate symbols that had to be inscribed around the mirror. I spent hours preparing, drawing the symbols on the floor and the mirror's frame with trembling hands. As the candles flickered in the dim light, casting eerie shadows on the walls, I recited the incantations from the book, hoping that my efforts would somehow drive away the malevolent force. As I spoke the final words of the incantation, the mirror began to tremble. The reflection grew chaotic, with a figure within it thrashing violently, as if in pain. I felt a surge of energy, a palpable sense of something resisting the ritual. The mirror seemed to warp and distort, its surface rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. I pressed on, determined to see the ritual through, despite the mounting fear and exhaustion. Suddenly, the reflection went still. The chaotic movements ceased, and the figure within the mirror stared back at me with an intense, piercing gaze. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional crackle of the candles. For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope, believing that the ritual had worked and the malevolent presence had been banished. But my relief was short-lived. The next day, the reflection resumed its disturbing behavior, and the sinister smirk returned. It seemed as though the mirror had adapted to the ritual, becoming even more defiant. The reflection now displayed a new level of malevolence, making direct threats and gestures that I had never seen before. It was as though the entity was mocking my attempts to rid it from the mirror, enjoying the suffering it caused. The situation grew worse with each passing day. I began to experience nightmares that felt all too real. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and find myself staring at the mirror, only to see the reflection performing unsettling acts. It was as if the boundaries between dream and reality had dissolved, and the terror from the mirror was seeping into my waking life. In a final, desperate attempt to understand what I was dealing with, I reached out to a medium who specialized in paranormal investigations. She agreed to visit my home, intrigued by the account I had given her. When she arrived, she conducted a series of rituals and seances in an effort to communicate with the entity within the mirror. As she worked, the atmosphere in the room grew heavy, the temperature dropping significantly. The medium's presence seemed to provoke a reaction from the mirror. The reflection became increasingly agitated, its movements erratic and violent. The medium attempted to communicate with the entity, but the responses were cryptic and disturbing, leaving us both feeling unsettled and fearful. During one particularly intense moment, the mirror's surface darkened, and a series of ominous messages appeared, scrawled across the glass in an unknown script. The medium interpreted these messages as warnings and threats, each one more chilling than the last. Sir, it became clear that the entity was not only malevolent, but also deeply entrenched in its existence, feeding off the fear and distress it caused. Despite the medium's best efforts, the reflection remained unchanged. The entity's power seemed to be growing stronger, its influence more pervasive. I was left feeling defeated and exhausted, my hope of resolving the situation diminishing with each passing day. The mirror had become a constant source of dread, a reminder of the terror that lurked just beyond its surface. The final act of desperation came in the form of a drastic decision. I decided to destroy the mirror. I believed that if I could eliminate the source of the malevolence, I could free myself from its torment. With a heavy heart, I prepared to shatter the mirror, hoping that its destruction would end the nightmare. On the appointed night, I gathered all my courage and stood before the mirror, a heavy sledgehammer in hand. As I raised the hammer, I took one last look at the reflection, which seemed to mock me with a sinister grin. With a final, determined swing, I struck the mirror. The glass shattered into countless fragments, each piece falling to the ground with a loud crash. As the dust settled and the echoes of the breaking glass faded, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the house seemed to lift, and the reflection's presence was gone. I hoped that by destroying the mirror, I had finally freed myself from the entity that had tormented me for so long. But as I began to clean up the shards of glass, I noticed something unsettling. The fragments of the mirror seemed to shimmer with a faint, eerie light. It was as if the malevolent force had left an imprint on the glass, a lingering reminder of its presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Thus, in the weeks that followed, I struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. The fear and anxiety that had plagued me began to dissipate, but the memories of the mirror and its reflection remained vivid in my mind. I moved to a new home, leaving behind the remnants of the old life and the cursed mirror. Yet, the experience left me with a deep sense of unease. I would occasionally catch glimpses of my reflection in other mirrors and feel a shiver of fear, wondering if the darkness from the old mirror had somehow followed me. The reflection of the stranger had revealed a nightmare beyond imagination, and though I had taken drastic measures to end it, I could never be certain that I had fully escaped its grasp. The mirror was gone, but the shadow it cast over my life remained, a constant reminder of the malevolent force that had once haunted me. And as I looked at my reflection in the new mirrors, I couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere in the shards of the old glass, a fragment of the darkness still lingered, waiting for the next opportunity to emerge. The reflection of the stranger had shown me a world of terror and horror, and though I had fought to rid myself of it, the lingering fear would always be a part of me.